The quiet act of kindness. It was a typical afternoon in the heart of the city, a city that never seemed to pause. The hum of bustling traffic and the sounds of hurried footsteps filled the air, echoing against the buildings that seemed to scrape the sky. The midday sun filtered through the dusty windows of a crowded city bus, casting long shadows on the floor. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of the world outside: petrol, city grime, and the faint scent of perfume worn by the passengers huddled together. Most of them were lost in their own worlds, glued to their phones, or staring out of the windows, waiting for the next stop to arrive. Among the commuters was a young boy named Eli, a quiet boy of about 15. He sat alone, making his way home from school. His crutches clicked softly on the cold metal floor with every step he took. He was used to the sounds now, the rhythmic tap, 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 as he made his way down the aisle of the bus. Some people stared as he moved. Others avoided eye contact, but Eli was accustomed to this, so much so that he no longer noticed. He had learned to tune out the stares, the whispers, the discomfort he often felt in crowded places. The bus had always been one of those places where he felt most visible, his disability marking him in ways that others didn't always understand. With every click of the crutches, Eli's thoughts wandered. His life, though full of potential, had often felt heavy. The crutches weren't just physical weight, but a constant reminder of everything he couldn't do, or so it seemed. But today, the city had an energy that felt different. The sun's rays bathed the interior of the bus in a warm golden light, and the usual mix of tired workers and bustling students didn't seem as oppressive. Eli had learned to love these moments, the ones where time seemed to slow just a little. The quiet moments that allowed him to escape into his imagination. As he scanned the aisle for an empty seat, he noticed one halfway down, nestled between two passengers who had already claimed the spaces next to the windows. With practiced ease, Eli navigated his way through the rows of people. Some made space for him as he passed, shifting bags, legs, and shoulders aside to accommodate him. Others didn't acknowledge him at all. He had learned that people, for the most part, avoided making eye contact, as if pretending not to see him made everything easier. But it didn't bother Eli. He had grown used to it. When he reached the empty seat, he took a moment to adjust his crutches, making sure they wouldn't slide or fall when the bus began to move again. He positioned himself carefully, his legs aching from the strain of standing too long, but the seat felt like a small victory. It was a moment of peace amidst the chaos of the city, the thrum of the bus beneath him reminding him of the world moving outside. The bus started moving again, jerking forward with a slight lurch, and Eli gripped the metal rail beside him for balance. The sway of the vehicle was comforting. It was like a familiar song, a rhythm that kept him grounded. He glanced around, letting his gaze drift over the other passengers. Most were lost in their own thoughts, some staring at their phones, others with their eyes closed, their heads leaning against the windows as the city passed them by. A few students near the back of the bus were chatting excitedly about their day. For a moment, Eli felt removed from it all. It was like they were living in a different world, one where everything was easier, and he was just a visitor. Eli pulled out the book he had tucked in his bag earlier that day. It was an old paperback, the cover worn from years of use. He had already read it several times, but it still held a magic for him. It wasn't just the story itself, though that was captivating in its own right, but the way the words had the power to carry him away from the world around him. The bus and the crowded streets outside seemed far away when he lost himself in the pages. But as he settled in, something, or rather someone, caught his attention. The bus doors opened at the next stop, and an elderly woman stepped aboard. She was small, probably in her late 70s or early 80s, with silver hair pulled neatly into a bun. She wore a soft blue dress that looked like it had been carefully chosen for the day. Her steps were slow but deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world. She was one of those people who moved with a quiet grace, despite the obvious weight of age that had settled in her bones. The bus was already crowded, and Eli watched as the woman gripped the nearest pole with one hand, trying to steady herself. The other hand clutched her purse tightly, her knuckles pale with the strain. As the bus jerked forward, making a sharp turn, the woman stumbled, her body lurching to one side. Her free hand shot out to grasp at the railing for support, but it was clear she was struggling. For a brief moment, Eli saw her face, a slight grimace as she fought to maintain her balance. Her eyes darted to the vacant seats, but none of them were available. Everyone seemed too absorbed in their own world to notice the elderly woman's discomfort. Eli's heart twisted at the sight. There was something about her that made him feel an overwhelming sense of empathy. She didn't ask for help, but Eli could see she needed it. Without thinking, he stood up, gently lifting his crutches and stepping aside to offer her his seat. The elderly woman looked up, surprised at first, her brow furrowing as if unsure of his intent. But when their eyes met, something shifted. Eli's act of kindness wasn't a grand gesture. It was simple, unspoken, yet it carried the weight of his heart. He didn't need to say anything. The quiet understanding passed between them. And without a word, she smiled softly and accepted his offer. "Thank you, young man," she said, her voice warm, but with a hint of surprise. Her voice was soft, but carried the kind of wisdom that only years of living could bring. "That's very kind of you." Eli didn't respond. He simply nodded, stepping back to give her space. His heart felt lighter, as if offering his seat was something he had been meant to do. There was no grand reason for it. It was just the right thing to do in the moment. And yet, as he stood there, something shifted within him. It was as if the world outside had momentarily quieted, and there was nothing else but that simple, shared moment between two strangers. The woman lowered herself into the seat, settling in carefully as if each movement required careful deliberation. She adjusted her bag and clasped her hands together in her lap. Eli returned to his standing position by the rail, his crutches steady in his hands. As the bus continued its journey, he tried to go back to his book, but something inside him felt different. He couldn't quite explain it, but there was an undeniable pull in his chest, as if he had done something more than just offer a seat. Minutes passed, the bus rolling forward as it passed through busy streets. Eli's thoughts wandered back to the woman, wondering who she was and what had brought her onto the bus that afternoon. He wasn't sure why, but her presence had made an impression on him, her grace, her quiet dignity, and the way she had seemed so at ease, despite the struggle she had faced just moments earlier. As the bus neared the next stop, Eli felt a light tap on his shoulder. He turned, surprised to find the elderly woman looking up at him, a soft smile on her face. "Excuse me, dear," she said, her voice gentle. "Would you mind if I gave you something?" Eli blinked in confusion. "What do you mean?" The woman reached into her bag, her hand emerging with a small folded piece of paper. "I don't often do this," she said, "but I feel that you should have this." She handed him the paper, her fingers brushing against his as she did. Eli took the note, still uncertain about what was happening. Before he could ask anything further, the bus jolted again, and the woman stood to leave. "I hope this helps you, dear," she said, with a final, knowing look. She moved toward the doors and stepped off the bus without another word, leaving Eli standing in the aisle, holding the small folded piece of paper in his hand, his mind racing with curiosity and a strange sense of anticipation. The message. Eli stood frozen in the aisle of the bus, the small folded piece of paper clutched in his hand. The bus hummed to life again as it lurched forward, but Eli barely noticed the motion. His mind raced with questions. Who was the woman? Why had she given him the note? And what did it all mean? The bus continued on its route, but Eli's focus was entirely on the note. He held it gently in his hands, almost as if it were a fragile object that might disappear if he wasn't careful. The woman had left so suddenly, almost as if she knew she had fulfilled her purpose. As the last of the passengers disembarked, the bus grew quieter, the only sound the soft murmur of the engine and the occasional rattle of the windows. Eli's heart pounded in his chest, the mystery of the note gnawing at him. He unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear it. The paper was old-fashioned, yellowed at the edges, and it had a weight to it that felt oddly significant. The writing on the page was elegant, each letter carefully formed, as if the words had been chosen with the utmost consideration. There was something timeless about the handwriting. It looked as though it could have been written decades ago, yet it spoke directly to him in the present moment. The first few words were simple. "Dear Eli." Eli's pulse quickened. How did she know his name? He hadn't introduced himself to her. His eyes skimmed the rest of the note. "I've been watching you for some time now, and I have something I believe you need to know. The kindness you've shown today, though small, is the key to unlocking something far greater than you could imagine." Eli read the words again, his brow furrowing. He had been watching me for some time. He didn't know what to think of that. The idea of someone watching him, someone paying attention to his actions from the shadows, sent a shiver down his spine. But there was something else in the message, something that felt important. The kindness he had shown, the small act of offering his seat to the elderly woman, had somehow set something in motion. He continued reading. "You have a gift, Eli, a gift that has been hidden within you for as long as you can remember. But it is not the kind of gift that can be seen or touched. It is something far more powerful. You are destined for greatness, and I am here to guide you on the path that will lead you to it." Eli's breath caught in his throat. A gift. He had never considered himself particularly special. He was just like any other teenager, trying to get through each day, struggling with his disability, and finding ways to make his way through a world that often seemed indifferent to his existence. He had no extraordinary talents, no great abilities, just a normal, quiet life. But this message, sounded different. It was as if the woman, whoever she was, knew something about him that he didn't. He wasn't sure whether to feel excited or terrified. A gift. Greatness. The words felt like they were meant for someone else, not him. The note continued. "You may not understand this now, but trust me when I say that your actions today were not just a random act of kindness. They were the beginning of something much larger. I will show you the way, but you must be willing to see it, and you must be willing to believe." Eli sat there for a long moment, staring at the note, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. What could all this mean? Who was the woman who had given him the note? How did she know about him? And what was this gift she was talking about? The bus was nearly empty now, with only a handful of passengers scattered throughout. Eli glanced up, momentarily aware of how the silence in the bus seemed to stretch around him, but it did little to calm his nerves. His gaze returned to the note in his hands. He read the last line once more. "I will be in touch soon. Be ready, Eli. The journey begins now." The final sentence hung in the air like a weight. Be ready. What was he supposed to be ready for? His mind was reeling. Was this some sort of prank? Maybe a sick joke played by someone who had been watching him for a while. Or was it something more? The way the woman had looked at him, there had been something in her gaze, something knowing, almost like she had been waiting for this moment to happen. Eli couldn't shake the feeling that his life had just taken a turn. But to where? And why? He took a deep breath, folding the note carefully and tucking it into his pocket. He wasn't sure what to do next. He didn't feel any different, and yet something inside him felt alive. Maybe it was the mystery of the note, or maybe it was the strange sense of purpose that now tugged at him. Either way, he knew he couldn't just forget about it. Not when it felt like his entire world had shifted in just a few short minutes. The bus slowed as it neared Eli's stop, the familiar sound of the brakes hissing in the quiet bus. He stood, still thinking about the note, his hands gripping the crutches more tightly than usual. His thoughts were muddled, but he knew one thing for certain. Something was happening, something he didn't yet understand, but something that would change everything. As the doors of the bus opened, Eli stepped off and made his way down the street. The world around him felt different somehow, hushed, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He didn't know what that something was, but he felt it in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't ignore it. As he walked home, the familiar sights of the city seemed to fade into the background. The trees lining the street, the sound of distant voices, the hum of passing cars, all of it seemed far away. The only thing that mattered was the note in his pocket and the strange, powerful feeling that something big was coming. That night, as he lay in bed, Eli stared at the ceiling. His mind kept returning to the note, to the words the woman had written. His gift. Greatness. He had no idea what it all meant, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope. What if she was right? What if he wasn't just an ordinary teenager, destined for nothing more than a quiet, unnoticed life? Could he really have a gift, something hidden inside him? And if so, what was it? He wasn't sure, but there was a stirring deep inside him, something he hadn't felt before. It was as if, for the first time, he was beginning to see the edges of a bigger picture, a picture he hadn't even known existed. The next morning, Eli woke early, his thoughts immediately returning to the note. He got dressed quickly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. The world outside his window looked the same, but to him, everything felt charged with possibility. There was a new weight to the air, a tension that wasn't there before. He didn't know what to do, where to go, or how to prepare for whatever was coming, but he knew one thing. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't pretend the note didn't matter, or that the woman's words hadn't left an indelible mark on his soul. Eli felt as though he were standing on the edge of something vast, something unknown. And despite the fear and uncertainty that churned in his stomach, he knew one thing for certain. His journey had just begun. And whatever it was that awaited him, he was ready, or at least, he hoped he was. The unfolding path. The days that followed the note were unlike any Eli had ever known. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was walking a path that had been waiting for him all along. Each step was filled with uncertainty, yet there was an undeniable pull guiding him forward, like a whisper in the back of his mind urging him to move. Eli couldn't shake the feeling that the note had planted something within him, a seed of change. It wasn't just a piece of paper with mysterious words. It had become a symbol of something larger than himself, something that hovered over him like an invisible hand pushing him toward an unknown future. He thought about the woman's words constantly. The kindness you've shown today, the beginning of something much larger. He couldn't help but wonder if there was truth to it. Each morning, he woke with a sense of expectation, as though something, anything, might happen, but nothing seemed to change. He went to school, did his homework, and lived his life as usual. His disability didn't suddenly disappear, and the challenges he faced each day remained just as difficult. He still had to use crutches to get around, still had to rely on the kindness of strangers to open doors or offer help when it was needed. But there was an odd sense of anticipation building inside him, as though he were waiting for a sign, for something to click into place. His thoughts were constantly drawn back to the note. He would pull it from his pocket in the quiet moments between classes or during lunch breaks. He couldn't help but wonder what it all meant. A gift. Greatness. He still didn't understand what the woman was talking about. But more than that, he wondered if he was the one who was supposed to find out. One afternoon after school, Eli found himself walking down a street he didn't recognize. It wasn't a particularly unusual route, just a few blocks from his usual path, but something about it felt different today. He wasn't sure why, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn somewhere. It was an older part of the city, one that had seen better days. The buildings were worn, their paint chipped and peeling, but there was something peaceful about it. The street was quieter than usual, with fewer cars passing by. He walked slowly, his crutches tapping lightly on the pavement as he moved, his mind a whirl of thoughts. Then, without warning, he heard a voice. Eli. It was soft but unmistakable. Eli froze, looking around, but there was no one in sight. The street was empty, save for a few stray dogs sniffing around trash cans, and an old man sitting on a bench, staring at the ground. He took another step, and again the voice came, this time from behind him. Eli. He turned quickly, his heart racing. A woman stood on the other side of the street, a figure in a long coat, her face obscured by the shadows. But even so, Eli knew it was her, the woman from the bus. She had the same silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, the same soft blue dress, though it was now covered by a long, dark coat. Her eyes glowed with an intensity that seemed to see straight through him. Eli felt a rush of emotions, surprise, confusion, and even fear. He had wondered if he would see her again, but he hadn't expected it to happen so suddenly, so unnervingly. His instincts told him to turn and run, but something kept him rooted to the spot. "Do not be afraid," the woman said, her voice calm but firm. "I am not here to harm you. I am here to help you understand." Eli swallowed hard, taking a step forward, though his legs felt unsteady. "How do you know my name?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Who are you?" The woman smiled softly, though it was a smile tinged with sadness. "My name is Celine," she said, "and I have been watching you, Eli. Watching you because I know what you are capable of, even if you do not yet understand it yourself." Eli felt a lump form in his throat. "I don't understand," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I don't feel capable of anything special. I'm just me." Celine stepped closer, her eyes filled with understanding. "You may feel ordinary, but you are anything but. The kindness you showed that day on the bus, it was more than just an act of decency. It was a sign, a glimpse of the power you carry within you." Eli shook his head, his mind swimming. "Power? I don't have power. I'm just a kid with crutches. I can barely even walk without help." Celine reached out, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "That is where you are wrong, Eli. You have a gift, and it is hidden within you, waiting for the right moment to be awakened." Eli met her gaze, his heart racing. "What kind of gift?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "A gift of perception," Celine replied, her eyes narrowing slightly, as though she were choosing her words carefully. "A gift that allows you to see the world differently, to understand it in a way that others cannot. It is a power that exists within you, but it has been dormant, waiting for the right moment to emerge." Eli felt a strange mix of disbelief and curiosity. "Perception? I don't get it." Celine's smile deepened. "You will, in time. But for now, know this. You are on the path to something much greater than you realize. The kindness you have shown is not just a random act. It is a key, unlocking a door that you never knew existed. And through that door lies a future you cannot yet imagine." Eli took a deep breath, trying to process the words. They didn't make sense, and yet something inside him stirred. He couldn't explain it, but he felt like he was on the verge of discovering something important, something that could change everything. He had no idea what that was, but the woman, Celine, seemed to believe it with all her being. "Are you going to teach me?" Eli asked, his voice a mix of hope and doubt. Celine nodded, her eyes softening. "I will guide you, but the journey will be yours to take. You must be ready, Eli. The world is changing, and you will play a role in it. But first, you must learn to see beyond what you know, to understand the forces at play in this world. You must open your mind, your heart, and your soul to what is coming." Eli felt a chill run down his spine, but the weight of her words settled in his chest. "What's coming?" he asked. "The time of reckoning is near," she said cryptically, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of anticipation and caution. "And you, Eli, are a part of it." Before Eli could ask any more questions, Celine turned and began to walk away, her steps light and deliberate. Eli stood rooted to the spot, his mind spinning with the weight of everything she had said. His thoughts were a blur, but one thing stood out above all else. He had just been given a glimpse of a world he hadn't even known existed. He didn't know what the future held, or what kind of role he would play in it. But for the first time, Eli felt like he was standing at the edge of something extraordinary, something that could change not just his life, but the world itself. The path ahead was unclear, but Celine's words had planted a seed in him. He couldn't ignore it. The journey was just beginning. And Eli knew that the answers were out there, waiting to be discovered. The awakening. The next few days were a blur. The feeling of anticipation Eli had woken up with each morning only grew stronger. His thoughts were consumed with Celine's words, her promise of a gift, a future he couldn't yet understand. It was as though his life had been split into two distinct realities. The one he had always known, filled with the familiar struggles of his disability and routine, and the one that had suddenly been opened to him, a world of hidden potential and unseen forces, waiting just beyond his reach. But despite the promise of something greater, life continued on in its ordinary way. School, home, friends, and the typical everyday activities filled the gaps between his moments of reflection. His crutches still tapped against the ground, still reminding him of the limitations of his body, and people still looked at him with varying degrees of pity, curiosity, and indifference. Nothing outwardly had changed. Still, deep down, Eli couldn't ignore the weight of Celine's words. There was a spark inside him, one that hadn't been there before. It was subtle at first, a shift in how he looked at the world, like something just beyond his reach, just out of focus. At times, when he was walking through the crowded halls at school or sitting quietly on the bus, he would catch flashes of something. A sense of knowing, a feeling that things weren't as they seemed, that there was more to this world than he had ever been taught to see. One afternoon, Eli found himself at a park near his school, sitting on a bench by the side of a small pond. He had been coming here often lately, drawn by a quiet, unexplainable urge. The park was peaceful, with the gentle rustling of leaves and the distant sound of children playing. But today, there was an odd stillness to the air. As he sat there, staring at the water, the memory of his conversation with Celine replayed in his mind, her words echoing with increasing clarity. "Your gift is in your perception," she had said. "You must learn to see beyond what is visible, to understand the world in ways others cannot." Eli didn't know what she meant by that. What was there to see beyond the ordinary? What could he possibly perceive that others couldn't? He had never been given any indication that he was anything other than just another teenager with a disability, struggling to get by. But as he looked at the pond in front of him, something strange began to happen. The surface of the water, which had previously been calm and still, rippled as though disturbed by an unseen hand. Eli blinked, unsure if his mind was playing tricks on him, but the ripples continued, moving in a pattern that didn't make sense. They didn't follow the usual rules of physics. There was no wind, no breeze to cause them. Yet the water shifted and swirled, almost as if it were alive. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he focused on the water. His heart raced in his chest, a sense of wonder building inside him. Could this be part of the gift Celine had spoken of? He reached out tentatively, his hand hovering just above the surface of the water, unsure if he was imagining things or if something truly extraordinary was happening. Then, without warning, the water began to respond to his presence. It moved in fluid, graceful patterns, as if it were reading his thoughts. As Eli's hand inched closer, the ripples grew stronger, more pronounced. It was as though the water was attuned to him, responding to his every shift, every intention. Eli pulled his hand back in shock, his mind racing. What was this? Was this his gift? Had he always had the ability to influence the world around him, and he had never noticed it before? Or was this something new, something Celine had unlocked within him? He could hardly believe what he was seeing. The world, once so solid and predictable, had suddenly become fluid, malleable. He sat back against the bench, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of it all. His heart thudded in his chest, and his crutches, which he had left leaning against the bench, felt oddly foreign to him now. He had always relied on them, But in that moment, he felt something deep within himself, the possibility that he no longer needed them, that perhaps there was more to him than just the limitations he had grown so accustomed to. But the water had stopped moving. It had returned to its normal state, calm and still once more. Eli could hardly believe it had happened at all. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the feeling that it had all been some sort of dream. Was it real? He whispered to himself, as if the world itself might respond. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him back into reality. Eli pulled it out and saw a message from his friend Marcus. "Hey man, you good? You've been acting weird lately." Eli stared at the message, his mind still racing from the strange event at the pond. Had he really been acting strange? He hadn't thought about it. He had been distant lately, lost in thought more often than not, but it wasn't just that. It was something deeper, something inside him that he couldn't explain. Eli typed a quick response, not wanting to get into details just yet. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just thinking about stuff." As soon as he sent the message, a feeling of unease washed over him. The world felt more alive, more vibrant, but it also felt strange, out of sync. There was something about his perception of things that had shifted, and though he couldn't put his finger on it, Eli knew he was on the edge of something monumental. His phone buzzed again, this time a notification from an unfamiliar number. Hesitant, he opened it. "Eli, this is Celine. I knew you would begin to see things differently. The water, the way it responded to you. This is only the beginning. There is much more to learn. Trust yourself and trust that your path is unfolding exactly as it should." Eli stared at the message, his heart pounding. So it had been real. The water had responded to him. But what did it mean? Why had Celine said it was only the beginning? He stood up slowly, his body trembling with a mix of awe and fear. He looked around the park, but everything seemed the same. The trees, the benches, the winding paths, it was all the same as it had been before. Yet he knew it wasn't. He wasn't the same. His perception had shifted, and in some way, the world itself had shifted with him. Eli's thoughts turned back to Celine's words. Trust yourself. He had always struggled with that, trusting himself, trusting his abilities. But now, something deep inside him urged him to take that first step, to believe that he was capable of more than he had ever thought possible. As he walked back toward the bus stop, his crutches tapping against the ground, Eli felt a growing sense of confidence, however fleeting. He didn't know exactly what lay ahead or what his gift truly was, but he knew he had to learn more. The journey, whatever it was, had only just begun. And for the first time in his life, Eli felt like he was ready to face whatever came next. "You said." The ripple effect. Days blurred into each other after the strange encounter at the pond. Eli's world felt both expanded and strangely fragile. The small events that once felt routine now held new weight, as though everything was interconnected in ways he had never before considered. His mind buzzed with the realization that something had awakened inside him. A dormant power that seemed to be tied to his perception of the world. Yet, despite the oddities he had experienced, a creeping doubt gnawed at him. Was it real? Or was it all in his head? Everywhere he went, Eli couldn't stop feeling like he was being watched, like there was something just beyond his understanding, just beyond his reach. He tried to go about his normal life, attending school, and hanging out with Marcus and his friends, but the nagging sense that he was being pulled toward something larger never quite left him. Then, as if to confirm his feelings, something happened that would set the course for everything to change. It was a Friday afternoon, the sun just beginning to dip behind the horizon, casting long shadows over the city streets. Eli sat at his usual spot in the back of the bus, his crutches leaning against the seat next to him. His backpack rested at his feet, and he absently fiddled with the note Celine had given him, feeling the creases of the paper between his fingers. The bus was crowded, as usual, with a mix of tired commuters and teenagers heading home after school. The murmur of voices filled the air, But Eli's thoughts were far from the chatter around him. He was lost in the idea of what his gift could truly mean. Was it just perception? Was it the ability to influence things, like he had with the water? Or was there more? As the bus rumbled down the street, Eli's attention was drawn to the person sitting across from him, a woman in her late 30s or early 40s, dressed in business attire. She was reading something on her phone, her eyes focused intently on the screen, oblivious to the world around her. Eli's gaze lingered for a moment longer than he intended, and in that instant, something shifted. The woman's phone flickered. It was subtle at first, like the screen had glitched for just a split second. Eli blinked, unsure if he had seen it clearly, but then the glitch happened again. The text on her phone momentarily scrambled, and the screen flickered in a way that was impossible to ignore. She didn't seem to notice, still lost in whatever she was reading. But Eli felt a jolt of recognition. He wasn't imagining it. Something was happening. His heart began to race. This was different from the water at the pond. This was something tangible. It wasn't a subtle shift, like the ripples in the water. It was like a digital anomaly, a momentary crack in the fabric of reality. Curious and slightly terrified, Eli reached out toward the woman, not knowing why or what he hoped to accomplish, but feeling an instinctive pull. He extended his hand just inches from her phone, watching intently as the screen flickered again. This time, the woman's gaze shifted, as if she sensed something was wrong. Eli quickly pulled his hand back, his pulse hammering in his ears. He wasn't sure what had just happened. Had he caused the glitch? Had his mere presence affected the phone? He glanced around the bus, but no one else seemed to notice. They were all too caught up in their own worlds. It was as if the glitch had only occurred for him, a brief window into something larger. It was disorienting, but it felt like another confirmation. Something was awakening inside him, and the world was reacting to it. The woman, still unaware of the brief anomaly, finally put her phone down and stared out the window. Eli continued to watch her, the seed of doubt taking root in his mind. Was this the power Celine had mentioned? Was it his perception that had somehow affected her phone, or was there something more at play here, something he couldn't yet grasp? As the bus neared his stop, Eli stood up, grabbing his crutches with the familiar motions he had perfected over the years. His legs felt heavier than usual, weighed down by the growing uncertainty and the questions that had no answers. The doors of the bus opened with a hiss, and Eli stepped off the curb, his crutches tapping against the pavement. The evening air was cool, the kind that made his breath visible in the dimming light. But as he walked down the sidewalk, a strange feeling washed over him, something deep and primal. It was as though the very ground beneath his feet was vibrating, subtly but undeniably. Eli stopped in his tracks, looking around. The people walking by were oblivious, lost in their own world. But he felt it, a shift in the atmosphere. His heartbeat quickened, and his hand instinctively reached for the note Celine had given him. The words on the paper seemed to shimmer for just a moment, as if they were alive, as if the note itself held something more than just ink and paper. Eli closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady himself, but when he opened them again, he was no longer alone. A figure stood at the end of the street, partially obscured by the shadows of a nearby alleyway. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. The figure's presence was overwhelming, and Eli's stomach twisted into knots. The man's eyes gleamed from beneath the shadow, an unsettling look of knowing, as if he could see straight through Eli. Eli, the man's voice was low, a rasp that seemed to come from the very air around them. "I've been waiting for you." Eli froze, his breath catching in his throat. Who was this person? How did he know his name? "Who are you?" Eli asked, his voice shaky despite his best efforts to sound confident. The man took a step forward, his movement smooth, almost deliberate. "I am someone who understands your potential, and I know what you've begun to awaken. I also know that you are struggling to understand it." Eli's mind raced. He hadn't told anyone about the strange occurrences, the water, the glitch with the phone. And yet here was a man, a stranger, who seemed to know exactly what was happening to him. "You're not the only one who has been touched by it," the man continued, his voice filled with something Eli couldn't quite place. "There are others like you, Eli. Others who are starting to see the truth, to tap into what lies hidden beneath the surface of reality. And there are forces that seek to control it, to suppress it." Eli's heart skipped a beat. Forces. Was this some kind of conspiracy? What truth? What hidden powers? His mind was on fire with questions, but the man's words held an undeniable weight. "What do you want from me?" Eli asked, his voice more composed now, but still filled with suspicion. The man's lips curled into a thin smile. "I want to help you understand your power, Eli. I want to show you the path that lies ahead. Because what's coming will require you to make a choice. And if you're not ready, if you don't know what you're truly capable of, you will not be able to survive it." Eli took a step back, his instincts screaming for him to run, but something in the man's presence held him there. It was as though a force stronger than his fear was keeping him in place. "What's coming?" Eli asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's gaze darkened. "The truth, Eli. The truth about who you really are, and what you're capable of. The time of reckoning is drawing near, and you are one of the key players in it. Your gift, your power, it's not just about seeing things differently. It's about shaping the world. But first, you must decide which side you're on." Before Eli could respond, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Eli standing in the middle of the street, his mind spinning with more questions than answers. The path had just become much more complicated. The crossroads. Eli's footsteps echoed through the empty streets as he walked home that evening, his mind whirling with the stranger's words. The man's message had left him feeling unsettled, his senses heightened, as if the world had become sharper, more intense. The uncertainty that had plagued him for weeks had now exploded into full-blown confusion. What was happening to him? What was this power he had only begun to understand? And more importantly, who was this man who seemed to know more about him than he did himself? The air around him felt heavier, as if the weight of the unknown was pressing down on him with every step. The world seemed quieter than usual, the sounds of the city muted, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Eli couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the cusp of something monumental, something that would change everything. His thoughts kept returning to the man in the alley, the way he had spoken, the way he had known about Eli's abilities, if they could even be called that, was beyond anything he had ever encountered. It was like he was part of some hidden world that Eli had unknowingly stumbled into. And now, the man wanted him to choose a side. Choose a side for what? Eli ran his hand through his hair in frustration, trying to make sense of it all. He had never wanted any of this. He had never asked for these strange occurrences, these inexplicable events that had begun to disrupt his life. All he had wanted was to get through his days, to deal with his disability the best way he knew how, and to live his life like any other teenager. But now everything was different. As he reached the familiar entrance to his apartment building, Eli's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, his heart sinking when he saw the message. "Eli, it's Celine. I need to talk to you. Meet me at the old library in an hour. Trust no one else. The time has come." The message was short, cryptic, and urgent. It sent a shiver down his spine. The old library. Eli had heard rumors about that place, how it was abandoned and filled with books no one had touched in years. It was an odd, eerie place, but he knew it well. He had always passed it on his way to school, though he'd never gone inside. It had always given him a strange feeling, like something wasn't quite right about the building. And now Celine was telling him to meet her there. What did she know that he didn't? He looked down at the note in his hand, the paper that had started it all. He had thought it was just a simple message, something to guide him through this strange time. But now he wondered if it was more than that. Had Celine known all along that things were about to escalate, that he would be forced to make a choice? With a deep breath, Eli shoved the note into his pocket and turned toward the old library. There was no time to waste. He needed answers, and maybe, just maybe, Celine could provide them. The walk to the library felt longer than usual. The streets were darker, the shadows stretching across the sidewalk in ways that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Eli's mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of information he had gathered over the past few weeks. The glitch with the woman's phone, the strange water at the pond, the men in the alley, and now Celine's cryptic message. It was all connected, but how? As he approached the library, its massive stone facade loomed ahead, covered in vines and grime, giving it an air of neglect and mystery. The building stood as a monument to the past, its grand architecture now faded and forgotten by the city around it. The windows were dark, and the entrance was locked, as if no one had dared to enter for years. Eli stood there for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest, feeling the weight of the choice he was about to make. Was he ready for this? Was he ready to face whatever Celine had to say? And more importantly, was he ready to confront the possibility that his life, the life he had known, would never be the same again? Taking a deep breath, Eli pushed open the creaky door, its old hinges groaning in protest. The library smelled of dust and decay, the air thick with the scent of forgotten stories. Eli's footsteps were muffled against the worn wooden floors as he made his way deeper into the building. The shelves stretched endlessly, filled with books that looked as though they hadn't been touched in decades. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint rustle of pages in the distance. As he ventured further into the heart of the library, a faint light flickered from one of the back rooms. Eli's instincts kicked in. It had to be Celine. He quickened his pace, his crutches tapping lightly against the floor as he made his way toward the source of the light. When he reached the room, he stopped in his tracks. Celine was standing by an old wooden table, a collection of dusty books and papers scattered around her. Her expression was serious, almost urgent, but there was a sense of calm in her demeanor as she looked up to meet his gaze. "Eli," she said softly, her voice carrying an edge of something unspoken, something heavier than he was used to hearing from her. "I knew you would come, but I wasn't sure if you'd be ready." Eli stood there for a moment, his breath catching in his chest. The weight of the situation settled on him like a heavy cloak. "Ready for what, Celine? What's going on? What do you know about all of this?" Celine motioned for him to sit, and he did, his crutches resting beside him. She looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the edges of a book that appeared ancient and worn. "Everything I've told you so far has been in preparation for this moment," she began, her voice steady, but filled with an unspoken urgency. "The power you're beginning to tap into, it's not something that's just about perception or influencing small things. It's something far greater. You're part of something much bigger than yourself, something that has been waiting for someone like you to emerge." Eli's brow furrowed. "What do you mean? I don't understand. What am I supposed to do with this gift, or whatever it is?" Celine's eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw something in her gaze, a depth of knowledge, of experience, that made him feel small in comparison. "There are forces, Eli," she said quietly, "forces that have been working in the shadows for centuries. They manipulate the world, shaping events to their will, keeping things under control. And they've been aware of people like you for a long time. People who can break free of their control, who can shift the balance." Eli's heart raced. "You mean this is about power? About controlling the world?" Celine shook her head. "Not control. It's about freedom. It's about breaking the cycle that has kept humanity in the dark for so long. You're capable of seeing the truth, of seeing through the veil of illusion that they've placed over everything. But there's a price for that, and it's not something you can ignore." Eli swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do?" Celine took a deep breath. "I need you to decide, Eli. The path ahead isn't easy, and it's not clear. You can join me. Help me fight those who want to keep the world in the dark, or you can walk away. But understand this. Once you step onto this path, there's no going back. The choices you make will ripple through the world in ways you can't even imagine, and it will change you. The weight of her words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for the first time, Eli understood the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about his powers. This was about something far larger, something that could shape the future of the world itself. The question now wasn't whether or not he was ready. It was whether or not he could live with the consequences of the choice he was about to make.